Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Ian Grettenberger. Ian will be covering, Ian is an extension specialist with UC Davis. In rice, he works on management of key arthropod pests, including rice water weevil, tadpole shrimp, and armyworms. His talk today is going to be on armyworm trapping, rice water weevil trials, and tadpole shrimp insecticides. Ian, whenever you're ready.
Is that good?
We do not see your screen yet.
Your screen. Thanks. Sorry. Oh, great. Yeah, that doesn't work. Let me see. Sorry, I'd switch computers because my, okay. Good?
Yeah, we see it now. It just needs in presenter view. Yep, perfect, we see it.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I using a different laptop. My other one wanted to update and I figured that could be a disaster. Okay, so yeah, thanks. I do want to thank the Rice Research Board for funding this work. And then also want to acknowledge that a lot of this work's in cooperation with Luis Espino too. So yeah, just first I want to touch briefly on some of the stuff we're doing on rice water weevil, and some of this stuff's going to be kind of a big overview at this point, just in terms of the amount of work that we're doing, and then there will be updates on the results later, the winter grower meetings and later in the year. But here's the rice water weevil. It's one of those pests that's historically been a big pest. It's less of an issue now. We're really not sure exactly what the reasons are, but we've been continuing to monitor population trends, and the last probably 8+ years, the populations have been pretty low, but it is still a pest. This is from last year, but there's the damage, and so it is a pest that we have to worry about. And then the other key thing with rice water weevil, it obviously causes that damage as larva, but then also it's just for registrations, it's a pest that's relevant across the U.S., across the southern growing region, where that's their primary pest. And so it's really critical for evaluating new insecticides and getting them into California. So we're continuing that work. And so for this work, we're using this is what right outside of the field 8 there, right next to the building at the Rice Research Station. But so, we use these rings and infest them with rice water weevils. And so most of this work is focused on insecticides at this point, plus a little bit of testing of susceptibility of different varieties, which I won't go into that at the moment, but that's also, important to keep testing new varieties as they come out to make sure that we don't have surprises with weevil damage. And so I just want to show what we're testing this year. We kind of limited some of the insecticides. Right now, there's not a lot of new insecticides for rice water weevil. The South has shifted in large part to seed treatments for rice water weevil, which isn't really something that we're using here in California. But as you can see, some of the standards that are used a lot in rice, so Warrior or Lambda cyhalothrin, testing that. And then also the diflubenzuron, which is a growth regulator, and then also testing an organic treatment there, Venerate. And then we're probably going to do some more greenhouse tests with some other biologicals as well, just to see how those affect rice water weevil. And so then moving on, so one of the other pests that obviously Luis has touched on that we're also working on is armyworm. It's one of those key pests in rice right now and can be a little tricky. This is what you see initially when armyworms are in there. You see a little bit of nibbling, but obviously the worry is that nibbling will turn into full-scale defoliation. And so figuring out where and when these populations occur is one of the key things, and something that we're trying to get a better handle on because detection is so key. And so, yeah, so I mean, when you're first, the egg masses are virtually impossible to find. We don't see them. And so this is what's happening initially in the fields. We find these little tiny larvae, but these guys are really hard to find. And so ideally there's a better solution than poking through the rice and really looking for these little tiny larvae. And these little tiny larvae, they're not doing much damage, but the worry is, right, if they keep growing, they turn into these big guys, and these are the ones that can defoliate rice pretty darn quickly. So we want a better sense of, when to know when these big ones might show up, the damaging populations. And so some of this is monitoring. So, for here, we're using the pheromone traps. So it's a female produced pheromone. We're trapping the male moths, so the male moths are attracted. And that's the gist of this tool in terms of monitoring. And so Luis has been running a monitoring network. If you haven't gotten cued in on this, definitely go to the Rice webpage there and sign up for the newsletter. But he runs a trapping network. And so that's partly what's been inspiring some of this various monitoring work that we're doing right now. And so one of the questions is, if you have traps, you're putting traps out, how many traps do you need? How well do those traps capture the spatial variation across the landscape, right? Because this is kind of what you might look at. Some people might be growing across a lot of acres, or fields might be spread out. So we want to know, if you get traps, put out traps, how many do you need to put out, and so forth. And so one thing that we're doing this year, the work that Luis is doing has a couple traps in a given location spread out across the whole rice growing area. Here what we're doing is we're putting out a lot of traps in a relatively small area to get a sense of the variation between traps. And so we have this grid on a half-mile grid that we have out there for monitoring for true armyworm. And so this just give you a sense of what we're seeing here. So these numbers are moving. So that just shifted through a couple of days, but the gist of it there is, we're actually seeing some hot spots like that top left one in red there, and figuring out, there's nothing clearly different about those spots, but there is some variation, which is going to be important when we're thinking about, if we do want to use these traps for monitoring and predicting when armyworms are going to show up. And so as part of this work, we're also doing, this is a continuation of work that Luis started, is within this grid and associated with some other traps too, we're also looking for larvae close to these traps to figure out, can we link trap captures to larval counts? And if not, then the next step would be figuring out why is that and what's driving those larval numbers. And another thing that we're still working on, this is continuation of work from last year. So we are working with some automated traps. That's it there on the left, and on the right is it's opened up to show there's a sticky surface there that can be circulated, or it's got rollers. And then there's a camera on the top that takes a photo. So these data are reported remotely. And the idea here is this is kind of real-time data. And so if we can better get a handle on the moth peaks and moth flights, then that might be better able to predict when egg laying is occurring, and these might play a role. And here's what the image looks like, and they do have some AI in there to recognize the moths. And so we are working with these again this year. And then the other pest that we also have here are the tadpole shrimp. These guys are obviously kind of funny as far as pests goes, which obviously Luis gave a bit of the background on how they work as pests. And they can come in quick and hard at the beginning of the season, which makes them a little bit different to control compared to some other pests. But really it's, as soon as you add water, there's the possibility for infestations if you have them in your field. And so one of the key things that we're doing this year is doing some insecticide testing. In the past, Luis has used some berm studies where he was giving the berms, the populations there, a chance to build this year. And so we did a lot of the insecticide work in these rings, the same rings that we were using for rice water weevil. And so we actually tried a couple different methods this year. And so on the left there, we have some rings, and so we're relying on natural infestations of tadpole shrimp there. The key indicator that there's natural infestations is just how murky that water is. So the shrimp on the outside of the rings, we're really stirring it up there. A little bit of wind, but that's really all shrimp. And so, you know, we're testing different insecticides within those rings with natural infestations. And then we also, on the right there, there's some rings that we set up in a field that doesn't really have many tadpole shrimp. And so there we were moving shrimp into the rings. And then we also had some other tests with those buckets there where we cut out the bottoms and put some holes in them and put mesh in them so that we could actually get better counts on them. But so we were putting these buckets in rings and then treating the rings with insecticides. So for the earlier ring study, which is early timing, and this is where we're relying on natural infestation, we're gathering data on shrimp plus stand counts. And so this is just the numbers or the various materials that we're testing. There's the active ingredients. There's also the timing, because shrimp are most susceptible when they're really tiny, but obviously getting the application on quickly sometimes can be a challenge, or sometimes shrimp can surprise you because, as Louise showed you, they can take off really quickly and grow very quickly. And just to note a couple things there. So diflubenzuron is a growth regulator. So the timing is probably is important. And so that we're testing that, also testing some various rates because it's not cheap. So that comes into play. And we're also testing a few new insect growth regulators. So Novaluron, buprofezin are growth regulators. And then that cocoa bear, that's actually an oil that's used for mosquito control. And what it does is gum up the surface. And so when mosquitoes go to the surface to breathe, it gums up their breathing apparatus. And if you've seen tadpole shrimp, oftentimes, especially once they're bigger, they'll go gill side, or so upside down on the water surface. And so the idea here is we might be able to gum them up with something like this. And this is a conventional material there. And then down at the bottom, we're also looking at biological control. So this is very early, there's mosquito fish in there very, very early. And this is for those rings, the density is for those rings. And in the later study, we had timings later. So when the shrimp were a little bit bigger, means that they're probably going to be a little bit harder to control, especially with the growth regulators that we have there. And I will note, so buprofezin, the growth regulator there, we actually jumped the rate because we saw in the first, with the lower rate from the first study, it didn't work. Looked like the entry did, so we tried a higher rate. And then we also tried an MSO as an oil, just to see what that would do to the shrimp there. And results we'll share the results to fall, but we'll say that Novaluron, the growth regulator, was highly effective. It's actually a known characteristic in that it's highly toxic to aquatic invertebrates, which normally is a problem, but if that can be taken advantage of in rice for shrimp management, that'd obviously be a good thing. And so just a photo and then just a moving image there on the left. They're kind of floating around. So this was actually with that cocoa bear oil. So they actually kind of got gummed up and then stayed at the surface. I think they were having trouble breathing at that point. So we saw some variable effects. It didn't seem to work as well as one might hope in terms of 100% control, but we were seeing some effects on the shrimp. And then this is what we see. We're looking at some plant stand. We're looking at those floating seedlings. And on the right, that's a plot that had really good shrimp control. Rice looked great. On the left, you see that small plants and really shoddy stand. And then finally, just want to touch briefly on something we're also continuing to do with shrimp, just looking at insecticide resistance, because lambda-cyhalothrin is used a lot in rice, as you can see here, and it's really effective for shrimp for the most part. It's very cheap, but it's used a lot, and so that puts a lot of pressure for resistance possibly. And so we are continuing work monitoring for resistance. So this is Luis out there gathering some soil. This was before rice was planted. So we're collecting a bunch of populations of tadpole shrimp and then seeing how resistant they are to pyrethroids, specifically lambda-cyhalothrin. And this is something, if anybody has had issues with shrimp management this year with pyrethroids, definitely let me know, and we can come take samples and try to test them. And so finally, just want to acknowledge the Rice Research Board for funding, grower and PCA cooperators for this work. Kevin Godding's my research associate that leads this, and then some undergrads, and Luis too. And I have this, so I'll just put it up, and I see that the poll's up as well.